Hey everyone, welcome back to Professor Crime for Sleep. Today we've got another true crime story for you. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss one of our daily episodes. Before we dive in, let me know where you're listening from and what time you're listening right now. I love seeing how global our community is. Alright, grab your headphones and settle in. Let's get into today's mystery. Story 1: True Crime Story. A dating murder that shocked the world. He was a national hero, a beloved football star who seemed to have it all. An icon who wasn't just a legend in sports. His charisma and million-dollar smile made him a fixture in movies, on TV, and in our very homes. But on a dark night in June 1994, a brutal double murder would destroy that image and pull the entire nation into a real-life drama that was more captivating than any Hollywood movie. Some criminals will do just about anything to cover their tracks, but there aren't many cases that come close to this one. This is the story of how a fairy tale romance spiraled into a blood-soaked crime scene, and how the trial of the century left behind a legacy of unanswered questions that still haunt us today. It's a case that forced America to confront its deepest divisions on race, class, and what justice really means. The story begins in Brentwood, one of Los Angeles' wealthiest neighborhoods. On the night of June 12, 1994, two people were brutally killed. Just after midnight on what was now June 13th, a man walking his dog stumbled upon a strange sight. A white Akita, its paws stained dark with blood, was barking frantically, as if it was trying to lead him somewhere. Concerned, the neighbor followed the agitated dog to a condominium on South Bundy Drive. What he found there was a scene of unimaginable horror. Lying on the walkway was the body of 35-year-old Nicole Brown Simpson. Nearby, wedged against a fence, was the body of a young man, later identified as 25-year-old Ron Goldman. Both had been viciously stabbed to death. The attack was a frenzy of violence that left a bloody scene on the quiet, manicured path. Nicole had been stabbed multiple times. The final wound to her neck was so deep it had nearly decapitated her. Ron Goldman, who was only there to return a pair of glasses Nicole's mother had left at the restaurant where he worked, had clearly put up a fierce fight. He had numerous defensive wounds, but he was ultimately overwhelmed. The only mercy, if you can call it that, was that Nicole's two young children, Sydney and Justin, were asleep inside the house, completely unaware of the horror that had just unfolded right outside their front door. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived, they were met with a brutal and bloody crime scene. There were no witnesses. The only immediate clues were a trail of bloody shoe prints leading away from the bodies and a single, dark leather glove, an extra-large Eris isotoner, left behind by the killer. To the left of the footprints, investigators noticed a series of distinct blood drops, suggesting the attacker had been injured and was bleeding from their left hand. The investigation into who could have done something so heinous began right away, and it didn't take long for the focus to land on one man. A man whose life had been tangled up with Nicole's for 17 years. Before he was a murder suspect, Orenthal James Simpson, or OJ as the world knew him, was the embodiment of the American dream. He rose from a humble childhood in San Francisco to become one of the most celebrated athletes in American history. On the football field, he was the Juice, a running back with almost mythical talent. At the University of Southern California, he won the Heisman Trophy, college football's highest honor. Then, in the NFL with the Buffalo Bills, he shattered records, becoming the first player to ever rush for over 2,000 yards in a single season. But OJ's appeal went far beyond the football field. He just had a natural charm, an easygoing personality, and a smile that could light up any room. He transitioned seamlessly from sports into a successful career in entertainment. He became a beloved sportscaster, an actor in movies like The Towering Inferno and the popular Naked Gun series, and the friendly face of Hertz rental cars, famously seen running through airports in their commercials. As one magazine put it, he was the first black athlete to become a bona fide, lovable media superstar. He moved effortlessly through the highest circles of society, a charismatic figure who seemed to float above the racial barriers that defined the world for so many others. In 1977, at the peak of his fame, O.J. Simpson walked into a nightclub and met an 18-year-old waitress named Nicole Brown. He was 30 and still married to his first wife, but he was instantly smitten by the young, beautiful blonde. Their connection was immediate and intense. After OJ's divorce, they married in 1985. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, the handsome, famous athlete and his stunning wife. They lived a life of pure luxury. A beautiful mansion in Brentwood, expensive cars, and two beautiful children. They were a Los Angeles power couple who seemed to have it all. But behind the closed doors of their Rockingham estate, the fairy tale was a much, much darker story. That idyllic image of OJ and Nicole's marriage, it was a carefully constructed lie. The reality, as everyone would later find out, was a relationship poisoned by jealousy, control, and escalating violence. Friends of the couple described them as volatile and mutually obsessed. The abuse apparently started early in their relationship and continued for years. The most public and chilling example happened on New Year's Day, 1989. Police responded to a 911 call at the Simpson home. When they arrived, they found a terrified Nicole hiding in the bushes outside. She was badly beaten, with a split lip, a blackened eye, and a handprint still visible on her neck. According to the police report, she cried, "He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me." OJ Simpson pleaded no contest to spousal abuse. His punishment was a slap on the wrist, a fine, community service, and counseling. The incident barely made a dent in his public image. For Nicole, this was just one of many incidents of abuse she documented in her diaries and letters. She wrote about being beaten, slapped, and kicked. Friends would later testify about seeing her with bruises she tried to cover with makeup. And the 911 calls didn't stop. In one terrifying call from October 1993, just 8 months before her murder, you can hear a frantic Nicole pleading with the dispatcher while OJ screams in the background, having just broken down a door to get to her. The tapes of those calls, played during the trial, gave the world a horrifying glimpse into the terror she lived with. Nicole filed for divorce in 1992, and she and the kids moved into the Bundy Drive condo, hoping for a fresh start. But she could never truly escape OJ's orbit. They had an on-again, off-again relationship for years, but the cycle of control and jealousy never stopped. Friends said OJ would follow her, show up unannounced at restaurants, and watch her from his car. Nicole reportedly told her mother and friends that she was afraid. She even confided in her friend Kris Jenner, "He's going to kill me, and he's going to get away with it." In May 1994, just a month before the murders, they broke up for what seemed to be the last time. With the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman discovered, the LAPD's focus quickly shifted to OJ Simpson. Detectives went to his Rockingham estate, just a few miles away, to inform him of his ex-wife's death. And this is where the case against him really started to build. When they arrived around 4:30 a.m., no one answered the door. While waiting, Detective Mark Furman, a name that would soon become infamous, noticed what looked like bloodstains on the driver's side door of Simpson's white Ford Bronco, which was parked crookedly on the street. After getting onto the property, Furman made another crucial discovery. On a path behind the guest house, he found a single, right-handed leather glove. It was dark, covered in blood, and looked like a perfect match to the one found at the Bundy crime scene. Meanwhile, detectives learned that Simpson had taken a late-night flight to Chicago. When they reached him by phone to tell him about Nicole's death, they said his reaction was strangely unemotional. He flew back to Los Angeles later that day and was met by police at his mansion. He was briefly handcuffed, but then went voluntarily to the police station for questioning. He had visible cuts on his left hand, which he claimed happened when he broke a glass in his Chicago hotel room after hearing the news. The evidence just kept piling up. A search of his home and the Bronco turned up more blood traces. The timeline of the night before had a critical, unaccounted-for window. Simpson had been at his daughter's dance recital earlier, where he was reportedly seen looking angry. He was last seen at home around 9:36 p.m. The limousine driver who was supposed to take him to the airport arrived at 10:25 p.m., but got no answer at the gate until nearly 11 p.m. The murders were estimated to have happened around 10:15 p.m. That left a gap of about an hour and a half, where Simpson's whereabouts were a mystery. He had no alibi. Based on the history of domestic violence, the physical evidence from Rockingham, and that suspicious timeline, the LAPD was convinced O.J. Simpson was their man. On June 16th, the world watched a grief-stricken Simpson attend Nicole's funeral with their children. The very next day, The district attorney's office charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder and told him to surrender by 11 a.m. The nation's hero was now its most wanted fugitive. June 17, 1994, is a day that's burned into America's collective memory. The 11 a.m. deadline for his surrender came and went. O.J. Simpson was nowhere to be found. Hundreds of reporters were waiting at the police station. Instead, his lawyer, Robert Shapiro, held a surreal press conference, announcing that Simpson might be suicidal, and then read a letter from O.J. that sounded very much like a suicide note. It ended with the words, "Don't feel sorry for me. I've had a great life." The LAPD officially declared O.J. Simpson a fugitive. A frantic search began. Then, around 6 p.m., a driver on a Southern California freeway spotted a white Ford Bronco and called 911. It wasn't O.J.'s Bronco that was already in police custody, but an identical one owned by his lifelong friend, Al A.C. Cowlings. When police found the vehicle, Cowlings, who was driving, told them over his cell phone that Simpson was in the back, holding a gun to his own head. What happened next was one of the most bizarre and captivating spectacles in TV history. For the next 2 hours, a fleet of police cars followed the white Bronco at a slow crawl, about 35 miles per hour, down the empty freeways of Los Angeles. News helicopters swarmed overhead, broadcasting the slow-speed chase live to an estimated 95 million viewers. It was surreal. TV networks even cut into Game 5 of the NBA Finals to show the chase. People lined freeway overpasses holding signs that read, "Go O.J. Go," cheering for him like he was still on the football field. The chase finally ended just before 9 p.m., not with a standoff, but with the Bronco pulling quietly into the driveway of Simpson's Rockingham home. After a tense negotiation, Simpson surrendered. Inside the Bronco, police found a disguise kit with a fake mustache and goatee, a passport, and a gun. The hero's flight was over. The stage was now set for what would be called the trial of the century. The criminal trial, the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, kicked off on January 24, 1995. From day one, it was more than just a murder trial. It was a media circus. Presided over by Judge Lance Ito, the entire thing was televised, bringing the raw drama of the courtroom into living rooms across the world. Every moment was analyzed, and every person involved became a household name. The prosecution team was led by Deputy District Attorneys Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. Clark was a tough, no-nonsense prosecutor who believed she had a mountain of evidence. Darden, her co-counsel, brought a personal passion to the case, sometimes visibly struggling with the racial issues that would come to define it. They were confident that the forensic evidence, especially the DNA, would prove Simpson's guilt. On the other side was a legal powerhouse, a collection of high-priced, high-profile attorneys nicknamed the Dream Team. The team was first put together by Robert Shapiro, a famous celebrity lawyer. But the man who quickly took charge was Johnny Cochran, a brilliant and charismatic lawyer known for his powerful courtroom speeches and his work on civil rights cases. The team also included the legendary F. Lee Bailey, Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz, Barry Scheck, and Peter Neufeld, 2 pioneers in the new field of DNA evidence, and Robert Kardashian, a close friend of Simpson's whose presence was meant to humanize him. This team wasn't just there to defend a client. They were there to win, and they were ready to use every tool they had. The prosecution had the science. The defense had a brilliant strategy and a story that would turn the whole trial on its head. The prosecution, led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, built their case on what they called a trail of blood that led directly from the crime scene to O.J. Simpson's bedroom. They laid out a seemingly unshakable mountain of forensic evidence, arguing that science itself proved Simpson was the killer. First, they established a motive. They presented the long, ugly history of domestic violence, painting the murders not as a random act, but as the final, brutal chapter in a long pattern of abuse and control. They put Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, on the stand, who tearfully described episodes of O.J.'s rage and violence. The prosecution argued that on the night of the murders, Simpson was filled with anger after the end of their relationship, and that this rage led him to kill her. Then came the physical evidence, the heart of their case. The DNA evidence, still a relatively new tool in courtrooms back then, was overwhelming. A drop of blood found near the bodies had DNA that matched Simpson's. A trail of blood drops leading away from the bodies and on the back gate of Nicole's condo also matched Simpson's DNA. In Simpson's white Ford Bronco, detectives found blood that matched Simpson, Nicole, and Ron Goldman. A trail of blood drops was found leading from where the Bronco was parked at Simpson's home all the way up to his front door. And most damningly, on the bloody glove found behind Simpson's house, DNA testing revealed a mix of blood from Simpson, Nicole, and Goldman. Beyond the blood, there were the bloody shoe prints at the crime scene. They were from a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe, a rare and expensive Italian brand. The prosecution then showed the jury a photo of Simpson wearing those exact shoes at a football game before the murders. Finally, there were hair and fiber clues that suggested the killer attacked Nicole first, then Goldman, then returned to Nicole. For the prosecution, it was a slam dunk. In their minds, the mountain of scientific evidence was irrefutable. It told a clear story. O.J. Simpson had gone to Nicole's home, murdered her and Ron Goldman, hurt himself in the process, and left a trail of his own blood all the way back to his bedroom. The Dream Team was facing a mountain of incriminating evidence, but they had a brilliant and bold strategy. They weren't just going to create reasonable doubt. They were going to put the entire investigation and the Los Angeles Police Department itself on trial. Johnny Cochran and his team figured that if the jury couldn't trust the people who collected the evidence, they couldn't trust the evidence itself. Their strategy was famously summarized as a three-pronged attack. The evidence was compromised, contaminated, and corrupted. First, they attacked the integrity of the crime scene. DNA experts Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld relentlessly questioned the police criminalists, suggesting the blood evidence was collected sloppily and stored improperly. They argued that samples could have been cross-contaminated in the lab. They painted a picture of a bumbling police force that was simply in over its head. The second, and most explosive, part of their strategy was to allege that the evidence wasn't just mishandled, but deliberately planted by a racist police department trying to frame a black celebrity. The focus of this shocking accusation was Detective Mark Furman, the man who found the bloody glove. During a brutal cross-examination, Furman denied under oath that he had used racial slurs in the past 10 years. But then, the defense produced bombshell audio tapes of Furman using vile, racist language over and over again and bragging about planting evidence on suspects in other cases. The Furman tapes were a seismic event in the trial. They destroyed the detectives' credibility and made the defense's theory of a racist conspiracy seem plausible. The third part of their defense was to create doubt about key pieces of physical evidence. They suggested police had taken a vial of Simpson's blood, drawn for reference, and sprinkled it at the crime scene and on other items to frame him. This corruption theory, while it didn't have direct proof, resonated with a jury that was already suspicious of the LAPD's motives. But the most theatrical and arguably most effective moment of the trial came with the infamous glove demonstration. Prosecutors, against the advice of their own team, asked Simpson to try on the bloody glove found at the crime scene. In front of the jury and millions watching at home, Simpson struggled to pull the leather glove over his hand. It was clearly too tight. This single, dramatic moment gave Johnny Cochran the defining phrase of the trial. In his closing arguments, he repeated it like a mantra. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. It was a simple, powerful, and unforgettable message that perfectly summed up their entire defense. The evidence just didn't add up. After more than 8 months of testimony and 150 witnesses, the case finally went to the jury on October 2nd, 1995. The nation held its breath, expecting them to deliberate for days, maybe even weeks. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering, but the jury returned with a verdict in less than 4 hours. On October 3rd, 1995, an estimated 150 million people stopped what they were doing to watch the verdict live. In the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The families of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman sat stone-faced. O.J. Simpson stood, his face a mask of anxiety. The court clerk read the verdicts. In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, we the jury find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder upon Nicole Brown Simpson. A shockwave went through the room. She continued, not guilty of the crime of murder, upon Ronald Lyle Goldman. Johnny Cochran placed a triumphant hand on Simpson's shoulder. The Goldman family sobbed openly. Ron's sister, Kim, let out a gut-wrenching wail of despair. Across the country, the reaction was immediate and starkly divided, mostly along racial lines. Images broadcast around the world showed many white Americans watching in stunned disbelief and anger, while many African Americans were shown cheering and celebrating. For many white Americans, the verdict was a miscarriage of justice. They believed a guilty man had gotten away with murder because he could afford brilliant lawyers to manipulate the system. For many African Americans, however, the verdict meant something very different. It was seen as a victory against a justice system they had long viewed as corrupt and racially biased, a system embodied by the LAPD and the racism of Mark Fuhrman. For them, the acquittal wasn't so much about O.J.'s innocence as it was a powerful rebuke of a system that had treated black defendants unfairly for centuries. The verdict revealed a deep and painful divide in American society that the trial had laid bare for the world to see. While O.J. Simpson was a free man under criminal law, the story wasn't over. The families of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown, devastated by the acquittal, filed a civil lawsuit against Simpson for wrongful death. The civil trial started in October 1996, and it was a completely different ballgame. First, it wasn't televised, so the circus-like atmosphere was gone. Second, and most importantly, the burden of proof was much lower. In a criminal trial, you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil trial, you only have to prove liability by a preponderance of the evidence, which basically just means it's more likely than not that the defendant is responsible. That lower standard made all the difference. The plaintiff's lawyers presented much of the same evidence, but this time, it was enough. Plus, O.J. Simpson, who didn't testify in his criminal trial, was forced to take the stand this time around. He denied the murders, but under sharp questioning, he couldn't convincingly explain away the mountain of physical evidence, including that damning photo of him wearing the Bruno Magli shoes. On February 4, 1997, the jury in the civil trial found O.J. Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of both Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown. They awarded the families $8.5 million in compensatory damages, and a few days later, added another $25 million in punitive damages, for a total of $33.5 million. It was a stunning reversal. The same man acquitted of murder was now legally responsible for the killings. For the Goldman and Brown families, it was a profound, though incomplete, form of justice. Fred Goldman, Ron's father, had become a tireless voice for the victims, and this verdict was a validation of his fight. But the victory was largely symbolic. Simpson claimed he was broke, and the families would spend the rest of his life fighting to collect even a tiny fraction of the money they were owed. The O.J. Simpson saga didn't end with the trials. He had more run-ins with the law and eventually served 9 years in prison for an armed robbery and kidnapping in Las Vegas, a bizarre crime that some saw as karmic justice. He was released on parole in 2017 and lived a relatively quiet life until his death from cancer in April 2024. But the legacy of the trial of the century is about so much more than one man. The case changed America. It kicked off the era of 24/7 cable news and reality television, turning a gruesome crime into a national obsession. It pushed the national conversation about domestic violence into the spotlight, shining a harsh light on a private terror that often hides in plain sight. The case dramatically increased public awareness and became a major backdrop to the Violence Against Women Act, which was signed into law just 3 months after the murders. It also brought the science of DNA evidence into the public consciousness, while at the same time showing how masterfully that science could be challenged in a courtroom. Most profoundly, it exposed the deep, raw, and painful racial divisions in the country. The case became a Rorschach test for America, where people looked at the exact same evidence and saw two completely different truths. 30 years later, the questions still linger. But in all the noise, the media frenzy, and the debates about race and justice, it's crucial to remember the two people at the heart of this tragedy. Nicole Brown Simpson, a vibrant mother of 2 whose life was stolen from her, and Ron Goldman, a kind young man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, an innocent bystander who died a hero trying to help a friend. Their lives weren't just plot points in a TV drama. They were real, and their brutal deaths left a void that can never be filled. This case may have shocked the world, but it shattered the lives of two families forever. Story 2: How two geniuses botched the perfect murder. In 1924, two young men were convinced they were gods among mortals. Their names were Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, wealthy, charismatic, and certified geniuses. They decided to prove their intellectual dominance by committing the perfect crime, a murder so flawlessly executed it would baffle police and cement their legend. They planned for 7 long months, considering every angle and, in their minds, leaving nothing to chance. But in their obsessive quest for perfection, they overlooked one tiny detail, a mistake that wouldn't just unravel their masterpiece, but would expose their genius for what it truly was: catastrophic arrogance. This is the story of how two of the most brilliant minds of their time orchestrated what they thought was a flawless murder, only to commit a series of blunders that turned their perfect crime into a perfect failure. On the surface, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had it all. Born into immense wealth in Chicago's exclusive Kenwood neighborhood, their lives were a portrait of privilege. Their families were pillars of the community. Loeb's father was a retired vice president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, and Leopold's was a shipping and manufacturing magnate. And from a very young age, it was obvious that both boys were exceptionally smart. Richard Loeb, known as Dickie, was the charming, handsome, and gregarious one. He was the kind of guy who could talk his way into and out of just about anything. His intellect was staggering. He became the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan, finishing his degree at just 17. But beneath that polished exterior was a mind consumed by a dark obsession: crime. While other boys were reading sports pages, Loeb was devouring detective stories, not for the thrill of justice, but for the thrill of the chase. He didn't want to be a detective. He fantasized about becoming a master criminal, someone smart enough to outwit the authorities at every turn. Nathan Leopold, or Babe, was a different kind of genius. More introverted and awkward, he was a prodigy in the truest sense. By 19, he'd already graduated from the University of Chicago and was making plans for Harvard Law School. He was a nationally recognized ornithologist, an expert on birds, and was said to have an IQ of around 210, capable of speaking an incredible 9 languages. Leopold was drawn to the complex and the esoteric, and his intellectual adventures led him to the work of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his concept of the Übermensch, or Superman. Leopold grabbed onto a twisted interpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy. He came to believe that certain superior individuals, simply because of their massive intellect, were exempt from the ordinary rules and laws that govern the masses. In a letter to Loeb, he laid out this terrifying belief: a Superman is, on account of certain superior qualities inherent in him, exempted from the ordinary laws which govern men. He is not liable for anything he may do. Though they knew each other as kids, their fateful bond was really forged at the University of Chicago. It was intense, complex, and deeply manipulative. Leopold was infatuated with Loeb, later writing, "Loeb's friendship was necessary to me, terribly necessary." Loeb, charismatic and exploitative, recognized this devotion. He held a powerful sway over Leopold, trading affection and intimacy for complicity in his escalating criminal fantasies. This toxic dynamic started with petty crimes. They'd commit arson, throw bricks through windows, and pull off minor thefts, all for the sheer exhilaration of it. For Loeb, the act itself was the point, but Leopold needed a philosophical justification. He framed their actions through his distorted Nietzschean worldview. They weren't just delinquents. They were supermen, testing the boundaries of conventional morality. But these small-time offenses quickly got boring. Loeb craved a bigger stage. He wanted to commit a crime that wouldn't just break the law, but would shock the world and prove, once and for all, their intellectual supremacy. He wanted to commit the perfect crime. Leopold, desperate to please Loeb, agreed. The pact was sealed. Their shared arrogance and twisted philosophies created a feedback loop, each one reinforcing the other's delusions of grandeur. In their own minds, they weren't just two brilliant students anymore. They were transcendent beings, about to execute a plan so perfect, so audacious, that it would echo through history as an act of pure, unadulterated genius. They believed they were above the law, above morality, and above consequences. And that belief would lead them down a path to conspire, to kidnap, and to kill. The plan to commit the perfect crime began to take shape in November 1923, a full 7 months before the act itself. For Leopold and Loeb, this murder wasn't about passion or revenge. It was an intellectual exercise. The thrill wasn't in the violence, but in the meticulous, cold-blooded planning, the creation of a flawless criminal masterpiece. The goal was simple: to experience the ultimate thrill and to prove that their superior intellects could devise a crime that police would be utterly powerless to solve. They spent months debating every conceivable detail, approaching the project with the same academic rigor they applied to their university studies. They decided the crime had to look like a professional job, which meant a kidnapping followed by a ransom demand. This would obscure their true motive, which was, quite simply, the act of murder itself. Killing the victim was a non-negotiable part of the plan. A live victim could identify them, and identification was the enemy of perfection. Their preparations were astonishingly detailed. To create the ransom note, they didn't just use any typewriter. In an act of convoluted genius, they actually stole an Underwood typewriter from Loeb's old fraternity house, typed the note addressed generically to "Dear Sir," and then returned it, believing this would make the note completely untraceable. Next, they sorted out the logistics. They established a fake identity, Morton D. Ballard, which they used to rent a dark blue Willis Knight automobile. This car, they figured, would give them anonymity as they cruised their own neighborhood looking for a victim. They bought supplies with chilling foresight: a chisel from a hardware store to use as a weapon, rope, and hydrochloric acid to disfigure the victim's body and prevent identification. The ransom collection was designed to be an impossibly complex puzzle. The plan involved a series of intricate, sequential instructions. The first call would direct the ransom payer to a specific spot, where they'd get another call with the next set of directions, and so on. The final step involved throwing the money from a moving train. It was a scheme straight out of the detective novels Loeb loved so much, designed to be so convoluted that law enforcement couldn't possibly follow or intercept it. The choice of victim was, in their minds, completely impersonal. For months, they didn't have a specific target, only a type: a young boy from a wealthy family in their Kenwood neighborhood. This was purely practical. A rich family could pay the $10,000 ransom, and a local kid would be easier to lure into their car. They considered several potential victims, but ultimately decided to leave the final choice to chance, picking whoever was most convenient on the day itself. Throughout these 7 months, their arrogance was boundless. They saw themselves as puppeteers and everyone else, their victim, the police, the public, as pawns in their intellectual game. One of them, seated in the back, lunged forward and struck Bobby over the head multiple times with the steel chisel. The boy didn't die instantly as they'd planned. Panicking, they pulled him into the back seat and forced a gag into his mouth to stifle his cries. Within moments, Bobby Frank suffocated. With the body of their young victim lying on the floor of the back seat, covered by a blanket, they began the next phase. For hours, they drove aimlessly, waiting for darkness to dispose of the body. In a chilling display of their complete detachment, they pulled over and bought sandwiches for supper, eating them in the car while Bobby's body lay at their feet. As night fell, they drove south of Chicago to a remote, marshy area near Wolf Lake, a spot they had scouted previously. There, by a lonely culvert, they dragged the boy's body from the car. In a futile attempt to hide his identity, they poured hydrochloric acid on his face and body before stripping off his clothes. They then unceremoniously shoved the body into the narrow drainage pipe, convinced it wouldn't be found for weeks, if ever. But in their haste, they were careless. Bobby's feet remained partially visible from the opening. Their task seemingly complete, they drove back toward the city. They stopped to mail the ransom note they had so carefully prepared, and, later that evening, Leopold called the Franks' household. Identifying himself as George Johnson, he coldly informed Bobby's mother that her son was kidnapped but safe, and that instructions would follow. They then got rid of the boy's clothes and tried to clean the blood from the rented car, telling a chauffeur who offered to help that they had just spilled some red wine. They believed they had executed their plan to perfection. The murder was done, the body hidden, the ransom demand initiated. They returned to their lives, even discussing the sensational news of the Franks' kidnapping with a feigned, morbid curiosity. They were sure they were in the clear, but in the darkness by that lonely culvert, in the frantic moments of hiding Bobby Franks' body, something had happened that neither of them noticed. As Leopold leaned over, something small and light slipped from his coat pocket and fell, unseen, into the muck. It was a single, seemingly insignificant object, a pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses. This tiny, overlooked detail, a product of pure carelessness, was the first major blunder in their perfect crime. It was the crack in the foundation of their elaborate scheme, and it would soon bring their entire world of arrogant self-delusion crashing down. Leopold and Loeb believed they had days, if not weeks, before anyone could possibly piece together what they'd done. They were wrong. The unraveling of their masterpiece began less than 24 hours after the murder. On the morning of May 22, 1924, a worker walking near Wolf Lake noticed something pale sticking out of a drainage culvert. It was the body of Bobby Franks. The discovery instantly turned a kidnapping into a murder investigation, and the case became front-page news across the country. Chicago was gripped by horror and fascination. Who could do something so monstrous? The police, under immense public pressure, launched a massive investigation. At first, they were baffled. The ransom note, the hidden body, it all pointed to a professional, cold-blooded killer. But there were almost no clues. Then, investigators found the critical piece of evidence, the pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses found in the mud where the body had been disposed. Detectives realized this was their only real lead. The glasses weren't a common style. They had a very distinctive, patented hinge connecting the earpiece to the frame. Police painstakingly traced the spectacles. They took them to an optometrist, who identified the unique hinge as exclusive to his shop. He told police he'd only ever sold 3 pairs of glasses with that specific hinge. The owners of the first 2 pairs were quickly cleared. The third pair, the optometrist's records showed, had been prescribed to a brilliant young law student named Nathan Leopold. On May 29th, 8 days after the murder, detectives arrived at the Leopold mansion. They didn't consider him a prime suspect yet. After all, he was a wealthy, respected scholar. They just wanted to ask about the glasses. When questioned, Leopold was the picture of cool confidence. He examined the glasses and calmly admitted they looked like his, but claimed his own pair was safely at home. When a search of his house failed to turn them up, he launched into a ready-made alibi. He told investigators that he was an avid birdwatcher and often visited the Wolf Lake area for his studies. He must have lost the glasses, he explained, on a recent birding trip. He was so confident in this story that he even offered reporters and police his expert theories on the crime. He casually remarked to one officer that if he were to murder someone, it would have likely been that cocky little son of a bitch, Bobby Franks. At first, police were inclined to believe him. Leopold's social standing and reputation made him an unlikely killer. To back up his story, he told police that on the day of the murder, he and Richard Loeb had been driving around in his car, picking up girls. When police questioned Loeb separately, he confirmed the alibi perfectly. For a moment, it seemed their story might actually hold. But the investigators remained skeptical. The police decided to dig deeper. They began scrutinizing every detail of the boy's alibi, unaware that they were about to pull on a thread that would cause the entire tapestry of the perfect crime to unravel with astonishing speed. The geniuses had made their second critical error. They provided a detailed, specific alibi, one that could be verified or, as it turned out, completely dismantled. The confident facade of Leopold and Loeb began to crumble under the intense police scrutiny. While their alibis seemed to match, the state's attorney, Robert Crowe, wasn't convinced. He sensed inconsistencies and ordered his team to verify every single detail. The fatal blow to their perfect alibi came not from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from a mundane and unexpected source, the Leopold family's chauffeur. In an attempt to help his employer's son, the chauffeur told police that Nathan's story of driving around with Loeb couldn't be true. He stated unequivocally that Nathan's car, the specific car Leopold claimed they were using, had been in the garage for repairs the entire day of the murder. It was an irrefutable fact that shattered their carefully constructed narrative. The alibi was a lie. Confronted with this, The two supermen broke. Their intellectual arrogance evaporated, replaced by raw panic. On May 31st, just 10 days after the murder, Richard Loeb was the first to confess. He admitted to the kidnapping and murder, but immediately tried to minimize his role, insisting that Nathan Leopold had been the one to strike the fatal blows. Shortly after, when Leopold was told that Loeb had confessed, he broke down as well. But his confession told a different story. He claimed that he was just the driver and that it was Loeb who had actually killed Bobby Franks. Each genius, in a desperate attempt to save himself, pointed the finger at the other. Their pact of superiority, forged in arrogance and sealed in blood, was broken. They were no longer partners in crime. They were just two terrified young men, each betraying the other to save his own skin. The confessions sent shockwaves through the country. The story of two wealthy, brilliant young men murdering a child for the sheer thrill of it became a media sensation. Newspapers dubbed it the crime of the century, and the horrified, outraged public clamored for one thing: the death penalty. State's Attorney Robert Crowe confidently declared, "I have a hanging case." Facing certain conviction and the very real threat of execution, the Leopold and Loeb families did the only thing they could. They hired the most famous and formidable defense attorney in America, Clarence Darrow. Darrow was a towering figure in the legal world and a passionate, lifelong opponent of capital punishment. He wasn't interested in proving their innocence. That was impossible. He took the case for one reason: to save the boys from the gallows. The trial began in July 1924 and became a media spectacle. Darrow, knowing that no jury in the country would spare his clients, made a brilliant strategic move. He had Leopold and Loeb change their pleas from not guilty to guilty. This bypassed a jury trial and left the sentencing solely in the hands of a single judge, John R. Caverly. Darrow hoped that one man, stripped of the mob mentality of a jury, might be more receptive to an appeal for mercy. The trial thus became a 32-day sentencing hearing. The prosecution presented nearly 100 witnesses, painting Leopold and Loeb as cold, remorseless monsters who deserved to hang. Darrow's defense was revolutionary. He didn't argue that they were insane in the legal sense. Instead, he argued that their minds were diseased, warped by their upbringing, their obsessive relationship, and their dangerous philosophical delusions. For the first time in a major American trial, psychiatric testimony was introduced not to prove innocence, but as a mitigating factor to argue against the death penalty. A parade of alienists, as psychiatrists were then called, testified that the boys were mentally ill, driven by forces beyond their control. The entire case was a battle over the very nature of human responsibility, and at its center stood Clarence Darrow, preparing to make the most important argument of his life. The climax of the trial of the century was Clarence Darrow's closing argument. For over 12 punishing hours, spread across 2 days in a sweltering Chicago courtroom, Darrow spoke without notes, his voice rising and falling in one of the most powerful speeches in American legal history. His audience was a single man, Judge John R. Caverly, and his goal wasn't to exonerate, but to save. Darrow's summation was a sprawling, emotional, and philosophical masterpiece. He readily admitted the horrific nature of the crime. Instead, he sought to explain it. He painted a picture of two young men whose brilliant minds were also profoundly sick, warped by loveless childhoods and philosophical ideas they were too immature to comprehend. Nature is strong and she is pitiless, Darrow argued. She works in mysterious ways, and we are her victims. He relentlessly attacked the prosecution's call for blood, framing it as primitive, vengeful hatred. "I have heard in the last 6 weeks nothing but the cry for blood," he declared. "I have heard from the office of the state's attorney only ugly hate. I have seen a court urged almost to the point of threats to hang 2 boys, in the face of science, in the face of philosophy, in the face of humanity." His argument centered on their youth. They were 18 and 19, legally adults, but emotionally, Darrow contended, they were still just boys. He appealed to the judge's reason and compassion, arguing that the state shouldn't stoop to the same level of cold-blooded killing. He concluded his epic plea with a profound statement on mercy. "I am pleading for the future. I am pleading for a time when hatred and cruelty will not control the hearts of men." When we can learn by reason and judgment and understanding and faith that all life is worth saving, and that mercy is the highest attribute of man. The speech left the courtroom, and the judge, visibly moved. On September 10, 1924, Judge Caverly delivered his sentence. While he condemned the crime in the strongest terms, he was ultimately persuaded by Darrow's arguments about their youth. He sentenced both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb not to death, but to life in prison for the murder, plus 99 years for the kidnapping. Darrow had won. He had saved them from the hangman. Leopold and Loeb were sent to prison to begin their sentences. Their lives as intellectual elites were over. For a time, they were kept apart, but were eventually reunited at Stateville Penitentiary, where they helped establish a school for fellow inmates. But their story took one final, violent turn. On January 28, 1936, Richard Loeb was attacked in a prison shower room by another inmate who slashed him over 50 times with a straight razor. Loeb died shortly after, at the age of 30. The attacker claimed Loeb had made sexual advances, though many, including Leopold, believed it was the other way around. Nathan Leopold went on to serve 33 years in prison. He became a model prisoner, wrote his autobiography, Life Plus 99 Years, and was finally released on parole in 1958. He moved to Puerto Rico, married, earned a master's degree, and worked for a church-run hospital. He dedicated the rest of his life to quiet work, a stark contrast to the audacious crime of his youth. Leopold died of a heart attack in 1971 at the age of 66. In the end, the story of Leopold and Loeb isn't one of genius, but of spectacular failure. They set out to commit the perfect crime, an act so flawless it would prove they were above humanity. Instead, they committed a crime riddled with foolish mistakes, born not of intellect, but of breathtaking arrogance. Their grand philosophical justifications were exposed as the pathetic delusions of two emotionally broken young men. Their meticulous 7-month plan was undone in an instant by a single, careless act, the dropping of a pair of glasses. They aspired to be supermen, but their confessions revealed them to be nothing more than terrified children, each willing to betray the other to escape the consequences. Their legacy isn't that of a perfect crime, but a cautionary tale. It stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how intelligence without empathy and ambition without wisdom can lead not to greatness, but to tragedy and ruin. They sought to be remembered as gods, but they are remembered as the two geniuses who botched the perfect murder. What do you think is the most shocking part of this case? Was it their motive, their mistakes, or Clarence Darrow's incredible defense? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching. Story 3: The Year the Mob and Hollywood Bled. What happens when the city of dreams becomes a city of nightmares? In 1947, Los Angeles was the most glamorous place on Earth. It was the radiant heart of post-war America, a city bathed in sunshine, its streets humming with optimism. Servicemen were home, the economy was booming, and Hollywood was churning out fantasies that captivated the world. It was a place where anyone, it seemed, could reinvent themselves. A girl from a small town or a boy from a crowded tenement could be reborn as a star. But in the shadows of the palm trees, a dark pact had been struck. The glamour was a veneer, a paper-thin illusion stretched over a foundation of corruption and violence. The same city that manufactured dreams also manufactured vice, run by men who dealt in fear, not fantasy. This was a Los Angeles where the line between a movie mogul and a mob boss was razor-thin, where power was a currency traded in backroom deals and enforced with brute force. Hollywood and the mob were in bed together, an unholy alliance fueled by money, celebrity, and secrets. And in 1947, the bill came due. That year, the city's two worlds, the luminous and the lethal, collided in a spectacle of bloodshed that nobody could ignore. In January, a young woman chasing fame was found brutally murdered, her body left in a vacant lot like a discarded prop. 6 months later, the city's most powerful and charismatic gangster, the man who brought the mob to the city of dreams, was executed in his own Beverly Hills mansion. These two sensational, unsolved murders would rip the mask off Los Angeles. exposing the rot beneath the glamour and revealing the year the mob and Hollywood bled. The story of 1947's Year of Blood begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling discovery on a cold January morning. On January 15th, a local mother named Betty Berzinger was walking with her young daughter through Limert Park, a neighborhood that was then mostly undeveloped, weedy, vacant lots. As she pushed a stroller along the sidewalk, something caught her eye in the grass. It was stark white. At first, she figured it was a department store mannequin, broken in two and tossed aside. She moved closer, and then the horror of what she was actually seeing hit her like a wave of ice water. This was no mannequin. It was the naked body of a woman, but it was a sight so grotesque it defied comprehension. The body had been severed cleanly in half at the waist. Her skin was a pallid, waxy white, as if the corpse had been drained of every drop of blood. The two halves were posed with a horrifying theatricality, her hands raised above her head, her legs spread. And most terrifying of all was her face. The killer had carved a bloody, permanent grin from the corners of her mouth to her ears, a gruesome wound that would later be dubbed the Glasgow Smile. Betty Berzinger snatched her child and ran to the nearest house, her screams shattering the morning quiet and summoning police to one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The world would soon learn her name, Elizabeth Short. She was just 22 years old. To understand how she ended up in that vacant lot, we have to go back and trace the path of a young woman who, like so many others, was drawn to the magnetic pull of Hollywood. Elizabeth Short was born in Boston, a child of the Great Depression. Her family was fractured when her father lost his savings, faked his own suicide, and simply walked away, leaving his wife to raise 5 daughters alone. Elizabeth, known as Bet to her family, was a striking girl with jet black hair and bright blue eyes, but she was also plagued by severe asthma. She dreamed of a life far from the cold winters and hardships of New England. She dreamed of California. By her late teens, she was living a transient life, drifting between Florida and California, where her estranged father was now living. Her time in Los Angeles was a cycle of fleeting hopes and harsh realities. We think of her as an aspiring actress, but the truth is more complicated. She had no known acting credits or real acting jobs. She worked as a waitress to support herself, moving constantly between cheap rooming houses and the couches of acquaintances, never putting down roots. She was a would-be, a fantasist who sometimes told people she was a war widow or had lost a child to seem more interesting. In the words of one researcher, she was a high-risk victim in a high-risk situation, dangerously trusting and often relying on the kindness or intentions of strangers. In the 6 months before her death, her life in Los Angeles was a social whirlwind. She dated numerous men, but seemed to float through these relationships. Her transient lifestyle and habit of wearing sheer, dark clothing earned her a nickname among friends at a Long Beach drugstore, the Black Dahlia, a playful nod to the popular 1946 film noir, The Blue Dahlia. It was a name she probably never even heard herself, but it would soon define her in death and seal her legend. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short was on January 9, 1947, 6 days before her body was found. A man she'd been seeing, Robert Red Manley, dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel downtown. She told him she was meeting her sister. Hotel staff later remembered seeing her making calls from the lobby. After that, she vanished. Those 6 days are a complete blank, a lost period that has fueled speculation for decades. What happened to her in those missing days is the central question of the entire case. When police began their investigation, they were faced with a crime of incredible brutality and almost no evidence. The crime scene itself was pristine. With no blood at the site, it was obvious Elizabeth had been killed somewhere else, her body washed clean, and then driven to the vacant lot to be found. The bisection of her torso was surgically precise, leading the FBI to investigate medical students at USC, a lead that went nowhere. An autopsy later revealed her cause of death was blows to the head. The mutilations had all been inflicted after she was already dead. What the investigation lacked in clues, it more than made up for in media sensationalism. The Los Angeles newspapers were locked in a vicious circulation war, and the story of a beautiful, mutilated young woman was just the kind of story they could exploit. They swarmed the case, plastering the nickname, the Black Dahlia, across screaming headlines. The press didn't just report on the story, they actively interfered. Reporters tricked Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, by telling her that her daughter had won a beauty contest, just to get personal details before breaking the news of her murder. They portrayed Elizabeth not as a complex, troubled young woman, but as a caricature, a promiscuous party girl who brought her fate upon herself. It was a narrative that played into the post-war social backlash against independent women, painting her as a cautionary tale. The media frenzy turned the case into a national spectacle, and tips poured into the LAPD. Then, about a week after the discovery, the killer themselves seemed to join the circus. The editor of the Los Angeles Examiner received a call from a man claiming to be the murderer. As proof, he said he'd mail them some of Elizabeth's belongings. Sure enough, a package arrived containing her birth certificate, social security card, photos, and an address book. The sender had used cut and pasted words from movie ads to write a note and cleaned the whole package with gasoline to erase fingerprints. Later, a series of taunting, handwritten letters arrived. One read, "Dahlia killing was justified." The investigation spiraled in countless directions. Dozens of men confessed to the crime. All of them were liars. The list of suspects grew to include doctors, drifters, Hollywood figures, and even, decades later, the famous director Orson Welles. One of the most compelling suspects to emerge was Dr. George Hodel, a prominent LA physician with a dark side. His own son, a retired LAPD homicide detective named Steve Hodel, later built an extensive case arguing his father was the killer. George Hodel had surgical skills and was secretly recorded by the LAPD in 1949 telling someone, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia." They couldn't prove it now. But despite the chilling recording and circumstantial evidence, charges were never filed. The Black Dahlia investigation wasn't just a failure to find a killer. It was a mirror reflecting the anxieties of post-war LA. By the spring of 1947, the case went cold. The murder of Elizabeth Short became the city's most enduring and gruesome mystery, a permanent scar on its glamorous facade. And it was only the first act. The year wasn't even half over. 6 months after the city was horrified by Elizabeth Short's body, the violence moved from a desolate lot to the private heart of Beverly Hills. On June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was at the lavish home of his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. He was sitting on a floral sofa in the living room, reading the Los Angeles Times. The drapes were open. Around 10:45 p.m., the quiet was shattered by gunfire. An unknown assailant, hiding in the bushes outside, rested a .30 caliber military carbine on a garden trellis and fired 9 rounds through the window. The hit was ruthlessly professional. 4 bullets found their mark. 2 hit Siegel in the head. The force of one of the headshots was so extreme, it was said to have propelled one of his eyes from its socket, sending it flying across the room. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the celebrity sociopath who dreamed of building a criminal empire in the California sun, was killed instantly. His associate, sitting right next to him, dove to the floor and escaped without a scratch. The contrast with the Black Dahlia murder couldn't have been more stark. One was a crime of bizarre, intimate cruelty. The other, a cold, efficient execution. One victim was a powerless nobody. The other was a man who commanded fear and respect. But to understand why Bugsy Siegel ended up dead on that sofa, we need to trace his own journey to Los Angeles. Born in Brooklyn in 1906, Benjamin Siegel clawed his way up on the tough streets of the Lower East Side. As a teen, he partnered with another young gangster, Meyer Lansky. Together, they formed the Bugs Meyer Mob, a notoriously violent crew. The nickname Bugsy, which he hated, was a reference to his volatile temper. Along with Lucky Luciano, they helped organize the street gangs into a national crime syndicate, a modern corporation of criminals. Siegel was one of the founders of Murder Incorporated, the syndicate's enforcement arm, and was personally one of the hitmen who took out the powerful old-world mob boss Joe Masuria in 1931. In 1937, the syndicate sent Siegel west to control their interests on the West Coast, particularly gambling and the horse racing wire service. And Siegel took to California like a movie star. He was handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. He threw lavish parties frequented by Hollywood's biggest names, like George Raft and Clark Gable. He was a celebrity gangster, one of the first of his kind, equally at home on a film set as he was ordering a hit. But Siegel's true ambition lay in the Nevada desert. In 1945, he became obsessed with an audacious idea. Just a few hours' drive from LA was the sleepy town of Las Vegas, a place with legalized gambling. Siegel envisioned transforming it into a glamorous resort destination. He took over a hotel project and poured his energy, and more importantly, the mob's money, into creating the Flamingo Hotel, named for his long-legged girlfriend, Virginia Hill. The Flamingo was Siegel's masterpiece and his undoing. The budget, originally $1.5 million, ballooned to an astonishing $6 million. His mob partners back east, including his old friend Meyer Lansky, became convinced the overruns weren't just inflation. They suspected Siegel and Virginia Hill were skimming millions and hiding it in European bank accounts. The grand opening on December 26, 1946, was a total disaster. The hotel itself wasn't even finished. Bad weather kept Hollywood celebrities away. With no rooms for guests, the few gamblers who showed up just took their winnings and left. In 2 weeks, the Flamingo lost over $250,000 and was forced to shut down. Siegel scrambled to fix the mess. The hotel reopened on March 1, 1947, and by May, it was finally starting to turn a profit. But it was too little, too late. The syndicate had lost its patience. In a now legendary meeting of mob bosses in Havana, Cuba, the decision was made. Ben Siegel was a liability. He had failed to deliver, and worse, they believed he had stolen from them. The contract on his life was approved, which brings us back to that night in June. The police investigation into Siegel's murder was a joke. This was not a mystery they were interested in solving. It was obviously a professional, mob-ordered hit. The timing was no coincidence. As Siegel lay dead in Beverly Hills, Meyer Lansky's men calmly walked into the Flamingo in Las Vegas and announced they were taking over. The transfer of power was seamless, executed with the same precision as the assassination. No one was ever arrested, let alone charged. The crime remains officially unsolved, though it's an open secret who ordered it and why. Siegel's death sent a shockwave through Hollywood. It was a brutal reminder of the true nature of the men the studio elite had been cozying up to. The line they had so casually blurred between glamour and gangsterism had been redrawn in blood, right in their own backyard. On the surface, the two murders that defined 1947 in Los Angeles seem like they're from different worlds. One victim was an unknown drifter. The other was a celebrity gangster. Elizabeth Short's murder was a crime of shocking, intimate horror. Bugsy Siegel's was a cold, impersonal business transaction. But if you look at these two cases as entirely separate events, you're missing the bigger, more disturbing picture of the city that produced them. They weren't connected by a shared killer or a direct conspiracy. They were connected by the rotten soil from which they both grew. 1947 was the year the parallel worlds of LA, glittering Hollywood and violent organized crime, bloodily intersected, revealing a city drowning in corruption. At the very center of it all was the Los Angeles Police Department. In the 1940s, the LAPD was notoriously corrupt. Payoffs were common, and allegiances were for sale. City Hall itself had been run by a machine that worked hand in hand with the underworld. This culture was still deeply embedded in 1947. The LAPD's vice squads were known to be on the take, protecting criminals who paid them off. It's no wonder the investigations failed. The department was tasked with investigating a world it was a part of. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder was chaos, compromised from the start by a media circus the police couldn't control. But some theories suggest the police knew more than they let on, and that the investigation was deliberately steered away from powerful people. In a city where a phone call could make a problem disappear, it's not crazy to think the Dahlia investigation was botched on purpose. A 1949 grand jury was even called to investigate the LAPD's failure to solve the Short case, a clear sign that the public had lost all faith in them. The Siegel investigation was a different kind of failure. It was less an investigation than a charade. The police knew it was a mob hit. Everyone knew. Investigating it would have meant taking on the National Crime Syndicate, an entity with deep connections and a proven willingness to kill. It would have meant exposing the network of corruption that let the mob operate in LA in the first place. The LAPD had no appetite for that fight. It was easier, and a lot safer, to just let the case go cold. So were there more direct links? Could the gangster and the starlet have actually crossed paths? Over the years, some authors have pushed theories. One book suggests Short was a call girl who became pregnant by a powerful newspaper publisher, and that Bugsy Siegel was hired to arrange her murder. But there is absolutely no hard evidence to support this. District attorney files show no mention of Siegel, and evidence suggested Short wasn't a prostitute. While a direct conspiracy is unlikely, it's not impossible their paths crossed in the small, incestuous world of 1940s Hollywood nightlife. Siegel had friends and interests in the clubs that Elizabeth Short was known to frequent. But the real connection isn't about whether they met. It's that they were both players in a dangerous game being played in a city without rules. Siegel was a king in that world, Short was a pawn. And in 1947, both were violently swept off the board. The twin murders served as a brutal awakening. The city had been sold a dream of sunshine and stardom, but the slayings of Short and Siegel exposed the nightmare underneath. The Dahlia case revealed a chilling misogyny and a press that valued sensationalism over humanity. The Siegel hit revealed that the gangsters Hollywood romanticized on screen were real. They were living in Beverly Hills, and they settled business disputes with carbines. Together, these two unsolved homicides marked the moment when post-war optimism curdled into noir cynicism. The City of Angels was revealed to be a place where justice was conditional, and where the most brutal crimes could be committed in plain sight and go unpunished. More than 75 years have passed. The vacant lot where Elizabeth Short was found is now home to a suburban house. The mansion where Bugsy Siegel was executed still stands, a quiet monument to a violent past. The world has moved on. The newspapers that fought over these stories are mostly gone. The LAPD has gone through generations of reform and scandal. And yet, the ghosts of 1947 remain. Both the murder of the Black Dahlia and the assassination of Bugsy Siegel are still, officially, unsolved. They've become Los Angeles' foundational myths, two parallel legends of bloodshed that continue to fascinate and horrify. They've spawned countless books, films, and theories. Why do these two cases, above all others, still hold such a grip on our imagination? Maybe it's because the lack of resolution leaves a void we feel compelled to fill. They are perfect mysteries, rich with glamour, violence, and sex, set against the intoxicating backdrop of post-war Hollywood. Backdrop of post-war, but their endurance is also about what they represent. The stories of Elizabeth Short and Benjamin Siegel are the twin pillars of the LA noir narrative. They're the story of the innocent drawn to the city's flame and consumed by it, and the story of the powerful who tried to master that flame, only to be burned himself. They are morality tales without a moral, crimes without punishment. In the end, 1947 was the year Los Angeles lost its claim to paradise. The brutal, unsolved deaths of a hopeful young woman and a charismatic killer exposed the city's foundational truths, that its glamour was a carefully constructed facade, and beneath it lay a world where the price of a dream could be your life. The question that hangs over the decades isn't just who killed them, but what does it say about the city of dreams that these are the two secrets that have never been told? The stories of the Black Dahlia and Bugsy Siegel are two of the most compelling unsolved cases in American history. What are your theories on these iconic cases? Do you believe the LAPD's corruption is the main reason they were never solved? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the hidden histories and dark mysteries of the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Story 4: The doctor who murdered 250 patients. He arrived with his black bag, a familiar sight on countless doorsteps across Hyde, Manchester. It was the same routine every time, a quiet ritual of trust and reassurance. 10 minutes later, the patient was gone, the death certificate signed, and the grieving family, often bewildered, found themselves thanking him for his kindness, for his gentle demeanor in their moment of profound loss. There was never any blood, no desperate screams, no signs of a struggle to alert suspicious neighbors. Just a quick, almost imperceptible jab in the arm, and another natural causes slipped into the ever-growing files. It was efficient, chillingly precise, and tragically, utterly devastating. By the time anyone at all, thought to piece together the chilling patterns, 250 quiet goodbyes had already been said, each one a life extinguished by the very man sworn to protect it. This isn't just a true crime story, it's a chilling testament to the darkest betrayal imaginable. This is the story of Harold Shipman, the mild-mannered GP who twisted the sacred doctor-patient relationship into a cold, calculated license to kill. And believe me, it's a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust. Harold Frederick Shipman entered the world on January 14, 1946, nestled in a working-class pocket of Nottingham. From the outset, his universe revolved around one person, his mother, Vera. She was the sun, the moon, and the stars of his existence, a powerful, almost suffocating presence. His father, a lorry driver, remained a distant, almost spectral figure, drifting through the periphery of their tight-knit, almost insular world. Then, the unthinkable happened. Vera was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, a cruel and relentless disease. Teenage Harold, poised on the cusp of manhood, watched, mesmerized and detached, as the local GP administered regular morphine injections. He saw how the drug eased her excruciating pain, bringing her moments of fleeting peace. But he also understood, with a chilling clarity far beyond his years, that each injection, while offering solace, also subtly, inexorably, shortened her precious life. Friends and family, looking back through the grim lens of hindsight, would later recall the boy's unnerving calmness during this period. While others wept, Harold observed. He studied the doctor's every move, his technique, the way the needle found its mark, the almost immediate effect of the powerful opioid. It was as if he were taking mental notes, a silent apprentice absorbing a dark lesson. This wasn't just a son grieving. This was a young man observing, learning, internalizing a profound, unsettling truth about power over life and death. At 17, Harold lost the only person who had ever truly held him, the singular anchor in his life. Something inside him, something vital and human, seemed to freeze that day, encased in a shell of impenetrable ice. Classmates remembered him as quiet, almost unervingly punctual, fiercely intelligent, but emotionally unreachable, a stark, unsettling contrast to the boisterous energy of other teenagers. One friend, years later, would perfectly articulate this chilling detachment. He was the boy who never got touched. There were no typical teenage fights, no rebellious outbursts, no passionate declarations. Instead, there was a sudden, almost unshakable conviction that medicine, specifically, was his calling. It wasn't a calling born of empathy, but perhaps of control. He sailed through grammar school with effortless academic prowess, secured a coveted place at Leeds University Medical School, and in 1970 graduated with a quiet, almost smug pride. To all outward appearances, he was born to heal, destined for a life of service. But beneath that perfectly tailored facade, the seeds of something far darker had already taken root. What was he really learning during those formative years? And what twisted interpretation of healing would he bring to his chosen profession? Fresh out of training, brimming with a quiet, almost unsettling confidence, Shipman secured a junior post at Pontefract General Infirmary. In the bustling, often chaotic environment of a hospital, he quickly established himself as brisk, efficient, and almost too eager to volunteer for the demanding night shifts. Deaths on his ward, while always tragic, drew little suspicion. After all, hospitals are places where sick people die, aren't they? It's an unfortunate reality of medicine. Yet, amidst the daily grind, two observant nurses began to notice something peculiar, a pattern that, at first, seemed like a morbid coincidence. Shipman's patients, particularly the elderly and infirm, often seemed to pass away shortly after he discreetly slipped in to check the drip. They joked darkly about the Shipman touch, a macabre phrase whispered in hushed tones over cups of lukewarm tea in the staff room. It was a nervous, uncomfortable humor, a way to cope with something their instincts told them was wrong, but their rational minds struggled to comprehend. But then, they'd drop it. Why? Because Britain in the early 70s was a different world, a place where doctors were still treated with an almost reverential awe, akin to minor deities. Questioning one, especially a seemingly competent and dedicated young physician, was practically career suicide. The thought of challenging such an authority figure was simply unthinkable, an act of professional heresy. So, the whispers remained just that, whispers, quickly silenced and swept under the rug of institutional deference. In 1974, Shipman moved on from the hospital setting, transitioning into general practice, a move that would provide him with an even greater degree of autonomy and, tragically, opportunity. He married Primrose Oxtoby, a sweet-natured receptionist he'd met, and together they bought a modest semi-detached house in the quiet town of Todmorden. From the outside, he was living the quintessential bland dream. A devoted wife, 2 growing boys, a sensible hatchback in the driveway, and a surgery filled with loyal, trusting patients. He was the picture of suburban normalcy, a pillar of the community, a man building a respectable life. But inside, beneath the veneer of domestic bliss and professional success, the chilling ledger of death had already begun to accumulate its grim tally. The Shipman touch was no longer a whispered joke. It was a silent, deadly reality, meticulously recorded in the hidden corners of his twisted mind. How many lives had already been quietly extinguished? And how many more would follow as he settled into his new, unsuspecting community? Todmorden in the late 70s was a world away from the bustling city, a sleepy mill town where the sheep on the surrounding hills arguably outnumbered the people. For a newly established GP, especially one with Shipman's peculiar internal landscape, general practice could be an isolating, lonely existence. It was in this quiet solitude that another sinister thread began to unravel. Shipman started writing himself prescriptions, not for common ailments, but for pethidine, a powerful opioid. He spun a plausible tale to his colleagues, claiming it was merely to ease the stress of his demanding profession, a common enough excuse in a high-pressure job. But the reality was far darker. He wasn't seeking stress relief. He was chasing the calm, detached euphoria that morphine had shown him in his mother's final, agonizing days. It was a twisted echo of that formative experience, a perverse pursuit of control and escape. His addiction, however, couldn't remain hidden forever. In 1976, a sharp-eyed chemist, accustomed to the rhythms of local prescriptions, noticed something alarming. Staggering quantities of pethidine were consistently leaving their pharmacy under Dr. Shipman's name. This wasn't a doctor managing stress. This was a doctor with a serious, dangerous drug habit. The alarm bells finally rang, albeit faintly. Local health officials, prompted by the chemist's vigilance, raided Shipman's practice. What they found was damning. Vials of pethidine stashed in his desk drawer, syringes carelessly wrapped in tissue paper, and a ledger overflowing with forged signatures, a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. A disciplinary panel was convened. Most doctors, caught in such a compromising position, would have been publicly shamed, their careers irrevocably ruined, crawling away in utter humiliation. Shipman, he simply received a fine of £600, a paltry sum considering the gravity of his offenses, and was ordered to attend a rehab program. That was it. No public outcry, no permanent black mark on his record, no widespread alert to the medical community about a doctor with a severe drug problem and a penchant for forgery. It was, in hindsight, an almost unbelievable display of institutional leniency, a colossal failure of oversight. Did Shipman feel shame? Regret? It seems highly unlikely. Instead, he simply packed his bags, severed ties with Todmorden, and with chilling ease, moved across the Pennines. He set up shop in Hyde, Greater Manchester, a new town, with new patients, and, most ominously, a fresh supply of blank death certificates. The pethidine episode, with its clear evidence of deceit and addiction, should have been a screaming red flag, a warning the size of a football pitch. Instead, it was quietly filed away, dismissed as a one-off lapse, an unfortunate but isolated incident. No one alerted his future employers to his past transgressions. No black mark followed him, no shadow of suspicion. He was, once again, simply Dr. Shipman, the reliable family doctor, the seemingly compassionate physician who always made time for the elderly. The system, designed to protect, had instead provided him with a new, fertile hunting ground. Hyde in the 80s was, in many ways, a quintessential British community. It was a place where neighbors still left their doors unlocked, where children played freely in the streets, and where the local doctor was often invited in for a cup of tea in the kitchen, a trusted, almost familial figure. Shipman, with his polished facade and seemingly impeccable bedside manner, thrived in this environment of unquestioning trust. He embodied everything a good GP was supposed to be. He worked long hours, often late into the evening, making house calls that others might have deferred. He remembered birthdays, inquired about family milestones, and, crucially, never rushed a consultation. He listened, really listened, or at least he appeared to. Elderly women, in particular, adored him. He'd call them dear, a term of endearment that melted away their loneliness, and patiently listened to their stories about grandchildren, their memories of wartime dances, the small joys and sorrows of their lives. If a husband had passed away years earlier, leaving them vulnerable and alone, all the better for Shipman. Lonely widows, desperate for connection and care, would readily invite him into their homes, offering biscuits and a sympathetic ear, believing they were receiving genuine care. And then, the ritual would begin. He'd bring his trusty black bag, a symbol of healing and comfort, into their homes. He'd ask about a fleeting chest pain, a minor ache, a hint of breathlessness. Any small complaint would do. With a gentle, reassuring smile, he'd roll up a sleeve. Just a little something to settle the blood pressure, he'd murmur, his voice soft and soothing, and the lethal dose of morphine or gelmorphine would slide home, delivered with the practiced ease of a seasoned professional. 10 minutes later, the kettle still warm on the stove, the biscuit half-eaten on a saucer, the woman would be slumped lifelessly in her favorite armchair or lying peacefully in her bed, her last moments stolen by the very hand she trusted. Paramedics, arriving in response to a distressed call from a family member or neighbor, would find Shipman already there, calmly and efficiently filling in the death certificate. The cause of death? Heart attack, stroke, old age, always natural causes. Cremations were a routine part of life in Britain, especially for the elderly. No autopsy, no fuss, just a quiet, respectful farewell. By 1990, Shipman wasn't just a popular GP. He was the most popular GP in Hyde, his patient list overflowing, his reputation unblemished. By 1995, the local undertakers, with grim gallows humor, even joked amongst themselves that business always seemed to spike after Dr. Shipman's afternoon rounds. They saw the pattern, the correlation, but they couldn't connect the dots. Why? Because nobody, not a single soul, wanted to believe that a doctor, a respected pillar of the community, could be the common denominator in this rising tide of quiet deaths. The cognitive dissonance was too profound, the betrayal too unthinkable. What kind of monstrous ego, what chilling need for control, fueled this meticulous, almost artistic destruction of trust? We can only speculate on the dark satisfaction he must have felt, playing God in plain sight. Kathleen Grundy was, by all accounts, a force of nature. At 81, she was a former mayor of Hyde, sharp as a tack, fiercely independent, and a vibrant presence in her community. She jogged each morning, volunteered tirelessly at charity shops, and was known for her quick wit and indomitable spirit. On June 24, 1998, she waved cheerfully to her neighbors, a familiar sight as she headed out for her routine checkup at Dr. Shipman's surgery. She walked into his practice, a picture of health and vitality, and then, inexplicably, she vanished from the world. The very next day, Dr. Shipman himself placed the call to Hyde Police. He'd found Mrs. Grundy, he reported, slumped lifelessly at home. Nothing suspicious, he assured them, just an unfortunate, if sudden, natural death. But Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor by profession, wasn't so easily convinced. Her mother had been robust, healthy, and fiercely independent. And, crucially, she had recently updated her will, a meticulous woman ensuring her affairs were in perfect order. Angela's instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. She smelled a rat, a foul stench of deceit beneath the doctor's calm exterior. When probate opened, Angela's worst fears were confirmed, and then profoundly amplified. She discovered a new, hastily drawn document, a will leaving everything, a substantial £386,000, not to her family, but to Dr. H.F. Shipman, in gratitude for his care. The signature was spidery, almost childish, utterly unlike her mother's elegant hand. The language within the document was stilted, formal, and strikingly out of character for Kathleen. And the witnesses? They were untraceable, phantom names on a page. This wasn't her mother's will. It was a crude, audacious forgery. Armed with her professional skepticism and a daughter's unwavering conviction, Angela went to the police. Detectives, initially reluctant to question a respected doctor, especially one who had reported the death himself, eventually yielded to her persistence. The evidence, though circumstantial at first, was too compelling to ignore. They secured an order to exhume Kathleen's body. The subsequent toxicology report was a damning indictment. Lethal levels of diamorphine, a powerful opioid, coursed through her system, far beyond any therapeutic dose. A handwriting expert unequivocally declared the will a clumsy forgery, an amateurish attempt at a grand deception. For the very first time, the mild-mannered doctor with the tweed jacket, the epitome of respectability, found himself facing a murder inquiry. The quiet, insidious reign of terror in Hyde was about to be exposed. The revelation regarding Kathleen Grundy's death sent shockwaves through Greater Manchester Police. They swiftly formed a dedicated task force, codenamed Operation Bloodglass, a name inspired by the psychiatrist who would later attempt to profile Shipman's chilling psychology. Initially, they had one count of murder, a singular, horrifying act. But as news of the investigation began to filter out, the floodgates opened. The phone lines at the police station began to ring incessantly, a torrent of calls from families across Hyde, each one echoing a similar, terrifying refrain. My mum died like that. He was alone with her. It was so sudden, so unexpected. Detectives, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of calls, began the painstaking process of mapping every death in Shipman's care, meticulously tracing back to 1977. The numbers grew, climbing with a horrifying regularity, until they reached a staggering number of potential victims. The scale of the potential atrocity was almost beyond comprehension. To gather irrefutable evidence, they had to confront the unimaginable, exhuming bodies, disturbing the peaceful rest of the deceased. 8 more bodies were brought up from their graves, each exhumation a grim, somber ceremony. And with every single one, the toxicology results were identical. Morphine or diamorphine found in quantities far, far above therapeutic levels. The pattern was undeniable, a macabre signature. Mostly older women, found seated comfortably or peacefully in their beds, their deaths always certified as natural causes by Dr. Shipman himself. Officers finally confronted Shipman in a stark, gray-walled interview room. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of hundreds of lives hanging in the balance. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, a picture of unnerving composure. He answered every single question, every accusation, every piece of mounting evidence, with the same chillingly calm phrase, no comment. Detectives, hardened professionals accustomed to the desperate pleas and frantic denials of criminals, felt a profound chill. The man opposite them showed no flicker of anger, no tremor of fear, no trace of curiosity about the overwhelming evidence piling up against him. It was like interviewing a stone, a perfectly polished, impenetrable monument to cold indifference. There was no remorse, no explanation, just an eerie, unsettling silence that spoke volumes of a mind utterly devoid of empathy. The investigation, once focused on a single murder, had now unearthed a mass murderer operating in plain sight, hidden behind the most trusted of professions. On October 5, 1999, the world watched as Harold Shipman, the seemingly unremarkable general practitioner, stood in the dock at Preston Crown Court. The charges were chilling: 15 counts of murder and a single count of forgery. The courtroom was packed, a palpable hum of anticipation and horror filling the air. Media from around the globe descended, recognizing the gravity of a case that would fundamentally shake the foundations of trust in British society. Prosecutor Richard Henriquez QC, a formidable legal mind, opened his case with words that would reverberate through the courtroom and beyond. "Members of the jury," he began, his voice cutting through the tension, "you are about to hear evidence of such arrogance and wickedness that it beggars belief." And for 11 agonizing weeks, the court listened, transfixed and horrified. Grieving sons and daughters took the stand, their voices trembling with sorrow and barely suppressed rage, describing healthy, vibrant mothers who had simply sat down for a cup of tea with the doctor and never risen again. Jurors were presented with the crude, damning evidence of forged wills, stark proof of Shipman's brazen avarice. They pored over toxicology charts, dry scientific data that painted a horrifying picture of calculated poisonings. They watched heart-wrenching home videos of women dancing joyfully at weddings, celebrating family milestones, full of life just days, sometimes hours, before their sudden, inexplicable deaths at Shipman's hands. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the doctor's facade, revealing the monstrous truth beneath. Shipman, in a move that spoke volumes about his arrogance and belief in his own intellectual superiority, chose to represent himself. He cross-examined witnesses, including the distraught families of his victims, with clinical politeness, never once raising his voice, his calm demeanor an almost unbearable insult. When he finally took the stand in his own defense, he remained steadfast, unwavering in his denial. Every injection, he insisted, was therapeutic, administered with the patient's best interests at heart. Every death, he claimed, was unavoidable, a natural progression of illness. He spoke of medicine as a calling, of patient comfort as paramount, his words a grotesque parody of the Hippocratic Oath. He believed his own lies, or at least, he presented them with such conviction that it was hard to fathom the depths of his self-deception. But the jury, after weeks of harrowing testimony, saw through the act. After just 4 days of deliberation, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all 15 counts of murder and the forgery charge. Mr. Justice Forbes, in a powerful and somber address, delivered the sentence that Shipman had so chillingly earned: life imprisonment with a whole life tariff. "You will spend the rest of your life in custody," the judge declared, his voice firm, "and you will die in prison." As guards led the unblinking doctor away, a lone woman in the public gallery, a victim's relative, finally broke the silence, her voice raw with years of suppressed grief and fury. "Rot in hell, Shipman." He did not look back. He never did. The conviction of Harold Shipman sent shockwaves not just through the legal system, but through the entire British medical establishment. The General Medical Council, the very body entrusted with upholding standards and protecting patients, swiftly struck Shipman off the medical register, a symbolic but necessary act. But the scope of his crimes demanded more than just a single conviction. High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith was appointed to lead a monumental public inquiry, a painstaking, 4-year investigation tasked with examining every single death connected to Shipman's practice. Her final report, delivered with somber gravity, was a devastating indictment of one man's depravity and a system's profound failures. It concluded that Shipman had murdered at least 215 patients, a figure so staggering it defied belief. But Dame Janet cautioned that the true figure could be higher, perhaps as many as 250 or even more. The inquiry meticulously detailed the systemic weaknesses that had allowed a serial killer to operate unchecked for decades. Crematorium forms, designed as a safeguard, went unchecked. Death certificates were rubber-stamped with alarming regularity, often without proper scrutiny. And the medical profession itself, steeped in a tradition of self-regulation, had policed its own with an almost medieval loyalty, creating an environment where questioning a colleague was simply not done. Families who had endured years of agonizing doubt, who had suffered the silent burden of suspicion, wept openly in the public gallery as Dame Janet Smith delivered her findings. She offered a heartfelt apology on behalf of the National Health Service, acknowledging the catastrophic betrayal of trust. Yet, in a bitter irony that still resonates today, no one else was ever prosecuted. The system that had enabled Shipman, the elaborate web of complacency and oversight failures, simply shrugged. It was a stark reminder that while the individual killer was behind bars, the deeper, structural problems remained largely unaddressed, a chilling testament to the power of institutional inertia. How could so many fail to see what was happening? And what does that say about the very nature of trust in our most sacred institutions? Following his conviction, Harold Shipman was transferred to Franklin Prison in County Durham, a high-security facility where he was segregated for his own safety. He was, understandably, a pariah, even among the hardened criminals. Inmates, with their own grim sense of justice, quickly dubbed him Doc Death, and would bang on their cell doors as he passed, a cacophony of contempt echoing down the corridors. Despite the hostile environment, Shipman maintained his unnerving composure. He kept a small library of medical textbooks, perhaps a desperate attempt to cling to his former identity, or perhaps a perverse reminder of the power he once wielded. He played chess by post, a solitary intellectual pursuit, and wrote endless letters proclaiming his innocence, convinced, or at least projecting the conviction, that he was the victim of a grave miscarriage of justice. Fellow prisoners and guards alike remarked on his almost unsettling tranquility. He seemed untroubled, unaffected by the enormity of his crimes, as if the murder of hundreds of innocent people was merely a minor administrative error, a regrettable misunderstanding. This chilling detachment, the same characteristic that had defined his murderous spree, remained steadfast even in the confines of a prison cell. Then, on January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, and, significantly, just hours before he would have become eligible to claim his NHS pension, a pension that could have potentially been used to compensate his victims' families, Harold Shipman was discovered. He was hanging from bedsheets tied to the cell window, a crude, desperate act of self-annihilation. A note, scrawled hastily on toilet paper, was found nearby. It read, in his characteristic, self-serving style, "I am innocent. Let my family move on." The news of his suicide elicited a complex, often contradictory wave of emotions from the victim's relatives. Some felt cheated of closure, deprived of the opportunity to confront him further, to hear him finally admit his guilt. Others, however, felt a profound sense of relief, a grim satisfaction that he could no longer inflict pain or mock their suffering with his cold indifference. The prison service, in the aftermath, issued apologies for procedural lapses, acknowledging that his suicide should have been prevented. But few guards, if any, genuinely mourned the passing of Doc Death. The man who had extinguished life with such clinical detachment, with such an absence of emotion, departed the world in the same manner, without fanfare, without regret, a final, chilling act of control. Harold Shipman's dark shadow still stretches long and cold across the landscape of British medicine. His crimes weren't just a personal tragedy. They were a systemic shock, forcing an uncomfortable, vital reckoning within the National Health Service and beyond. The trust, once absolute, was shattered, and the scramble to rebuild it led to profound, lasting changes. Today, every GP in the UK faces regular, rigorous audits of their practice, a direct consequence of Shipman's unchecked reign. Death certificates, once easily rubber-stamped, now trigger computer flags if a single doctor oversees too many cremations, especially of elderly patients. A national coroner's service, an idea mooted for decades but always resisted, finally began rolling out in 2009. This centralized system ensures greater scrutiny over sudden or unexplained deaths, removing the localized blind spots that Shipman so expertly exploited. Yet, the deeper scar left by Shipman is psychological, an insidious wound on the very fabric of the doctor-patient relationship. It was a betrayal of an institution built on the most fundamental human trust. Elderly patients, once unreserved in their faith, now eye their doctors with unspoken questions, a flicker of doubt in their gaze. Families, once content to leave medical matters to the professionals, now Google morphine dosages, questioning prescriptions, their vigilance born of a hard-won, painful lesson. Undertakers, once joking about Dr. Shipman's busy schedule, now quietly note patterns, their professional observations sharpened by the chilling memory of Hyde. Harold Shipman proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that evil can wear the most respectable face, that it can hide behind a gentle smile and a reassuring bedside manner. And that trust, once poisoned, once so profoundly violated, is the hardest symptom to treat, a lingering, pervasive ache in the heart of healthcare. His story stands as a stark, enduring warning. Vigilance is not just for strangers. Sometimes, it's for those we trust the most. If this story unsettled you, if it left you with a knot in your stomach, believe me, you're not alone. The thought that the very person meant to heal us could, with chilling precision, choose to kill is enough to make anyone wary, to question the unquestionable. It's a reminder that even in the most revered professions, darkness can lurk. So, if you found this deep dive into one of history's most shocking medical crimes compelling, hit that subscribe button for more true crime stories that peel back the layers of human nature. Leave a comment below and tell me, what's the case that keeps you up at night? The one that still haunts your thoughts? And please, share this video with that friend who still believes doctors are above suspicion. Because the only way systems change, the only way we prevent history from repeating itself, is when we keep asking questions, hard questions, and absolutely refuse to accept no comment for an answer. Story 5: 2 massacres in 1 month, Brazil's bloodiest summer. You know, sometimes history doesn't just unfold, it explodes. And in the early 90s, Brazil was a powder keg, coughing up inflation like a dying engine. Picture this: Rio de Janeiro, a city of breathtaking beauty, where the rich ordered another caipirinha on Ipanema Beach, completely oblivious to the chaos, while the poor, just a few miles away, scavenged for dinner in restaurant bins, their dreams as shattered as the discarded glass. In this fractured landscape, the military police, those guys in berets you sometimes see on postcards, meant to protect and serve, well, they moonlighted as something far more sinister: freelance exterminators. It sounds like a bad movie plot, doesn't it? But it was chillingly real. One sweltering night in July, a squad of these officers drove past a grand, colonial church, Candelaria, right in the heart of the city. They saw a bunch of shoeless kids, some barely teenagers, huddled together, trying to snatch a few hours of sleep on the cold stone steps. And they didn't see children, they saw a litter. They decided, with chilling efficiency, to clean house. 8 children never woke up. The city hadn't even finished screaming, hadn't quite processed the horror, when another squad, fueled by a different kind of rage, kicked down doors in a nearby favela, Vigário Geral. In a brutal, indiscriminate frenzy, they erased 21 lives in 20 minutes. 2 massacres, 1 month, 0 meaningful convictions. Welcome, my friends, to Brazil's bloodiest summer. It's a story not just about violence, but about the insidious ways a society can normalize the unthinkable. Let's rewind a bit, set the stage. Imagine Rio in 1993. It wasn't just hot, it was boiling with economic and social unrest. Hyperinflation wasn't just a number, it was a monster devouring everything in its path, sometimes hitting an astronomical 2,000% annually. Think about that for a second. Your wages, your hard-earned money, evaporating before you could even cash the check. People were desperate, hungry, and angry. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a daily struggle for survival, a constant, gnawing anxiety that permeated every corner of life, especially for those already on the margins. Amidst this economic turmoil, Brazil had a new president, Fernando Collor de Mello, who came in talking tough on crime, promising to restore order. And when politicians talk tough on crime in a country grappling with such widespread poverty and social breakdown, who usually pays the price? Not the powerful, not the well-connected. It's always the most vulnerable. So, in their desperate scramble for a quick win, for some semblance of control, the government essentially handed the police loose rules of engagement. They gave them a long leash, and even looser oversight. It was an open invitation for abuse. In that vacuum, a culture of absolute impunity didn't just sprout. It blossomed like a toxic weed. Officers, especially in the military police, started keeping personal kill tallies, not like grim records, but like baseball stats, a perverse badge of honor. It was a macabre competition, a chilling normalization of violence. And who became the perfect target for this brutal cleanup? Street children. They were visible, sleeping out in the open. They were powerless, with no families or connections to protect them. And perhaps most critically, they were already blamed for every purse-snatching downtown, every petty theft, every sign of urban decay. They were convenient scapegoats, easy to demonize, easier to erase. Candelaria Church, a magnificent architectural landmark, stood smack beside the bustling financial district. For years, it had, out of necessity, doubled as an impromptu dormitory for these kids. It was a place where they could find a little shelter from the elements, a momentary reprieve from the harsh streets. Parish staff, bless their hearts, did what they could, offering food, basic medical aid, and a fleeting semblance of safety. But for the businessmen in their crisp suits, stepping over small, sleeping bodies on their way to work Monday morning, these children weren't human beings in need. They were, in their cold, calculated view, simply litter that needed collecting. An unsightly stain on the city's gleaming facade. The stage was set for tragedy. The air in Rio in July 1993 was thick with tension, not just humidity. On the afternoon of July 22nd, a seemingly minor incident occurred, but it was the kind of spark that ignites a powder keg. A group of officers from the 16th Military Police Battalion, cruising by Candelaria Church, windows down, probably feeling untouchable in their patrol car, decided to engage in some casual intimidation. They catcalled girls, waved their guns around, just trying to scare the boys who called the church steps home. It was a display of power, a taunt. But these kids, despite their vulnerability, weren't completely broken. Someone, perhaps out of frustration, fear, or a desperate act of defiance, threw a stone. It wasn't a Molotov cocktail. It was a rock, probably small, but it found its mark. The windshield of the police car spiderwebbed, a crack spreading across the glass, mirroring the cracks in society itself. The cops, their fragile authority momentarily challenged, sped off. But not before shouting a chilling promise. "We'll be back." Now, you might dismiss that as standard tough guy banter, the kind of empty threat you hear in movies. But in Rio, in that particular moment in time, the police had a terrifying habit of keeping promises, especially when those promises were written in blood. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a declaration of war against the city's most defenseless. It was a line crossed, a signal that their perceived authority had been challenged, and a brutal lesson would be taught. The stone wasn't just a projectile. It was the trigger for an unimaginable act of terror. The city slept, or tried to, under the oppressive heat of July 23rd. Just past midnight, the silence was shattered. Two cars, dark and menacing, returned to Candelaria Church. For men, not in uniform this time, but in plain clothes, emerged. Yet, the chilling giveaway was the hardware they carried. Regulation AR-15 rifles. These weren't random thugs. These were disciplined, armed professionals, acting with a cold, calculated purpose. They approached the steps where children lay sleeping, their dreams likely filled with the day's scraps and the hope of tomorrow's survival. The attackers didn't hesitate. They yanked 3 sleeping adolescents, Wagner, Marcelo, and Louise, from their makeshift beds. Imagine the terror, the sudden jolt from sleep to absolute horror. They were forced face down onto the pavement, their young lives about to be snuffed out with brutal efficiency. And then, the unspeakable. Each was executed with a single shot to the head. No trial, no mercy, just a bullet. The sudden, brutal sound of the gunfire, amplified in the night, shattered the fragile peace. The remaining kids, roused from sleep, scattered in a desperate, panicked frenzy. The shoot and dozens more, though physically unharmed, were psychologically shattered, their innocence irrevocably lost, replaced by nightmares that would haunt them for decades. The youngest victim was a mere 11 years old. 11. Think about that. A child, sleeping on church steps, murdered for the crime of existing. The Candelaria massacre wasn't just a crime. It was a brutal assault on the very idea of childhood, a horrifying testament to how far a society can fall when it dehumanizes its most vulnerable. The morning after Candelaria was a punch to the gut for Brazil. Front-page photos of tiny, zipped body bags, lined up grimly outside the majestic church, ignited a national fury. It wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a searing indictment of the state. Suddenly, TV anchors who usually reported the latest soccer scores, shifting effortlessly from celebratory goals to grim statistics, were speaking in hushed, somber tones about human rights conventions, about the sanctity of life, about the need for justice. The international community, too, watched in horror, the spotlight of global condemnation beginning to shine on Brazil. But here's the truly sickening part. Inside precincts, in the very heart of the institutions meant to uphold the law, some officers were reportedly toasting the cleanup operation. Can you imagine? celebrating the murder of children. It speaks volumes about the twisted morality that had taken root within parts of the military police. One lieutenant, allegedly emboldened by this warped sense of triumph, reportedly told journalists, with chilling casualness, "Street kids become criminals. Better stop them early." This wasn't just an isolated statement. It was a reflection of a deeply ingrained ideology, a belief that certain lives were disposable, that preemptive violence was justifiable. Public outrage, however strong, however vocal, however widespread, crashed head-on with a justice system that was, to put it mildly, rigged. It wasn't just biased. It was fundamentally structured to protect uniforms, to shield its own, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of depravity. The system, designed to deliver justice, instead became a shield for perpetrators. This was the first, brutal lesson in how deeply impunity ran in Brazil, a lesson that would be painfully reinforced again and again. The morning after Candelaria wasn't just about grief. It was about the dawning, horrifying realization that the very institutions meant to protect could, with impunity, destroy. After the Candelaria massacre, Rio held its breath. For 5 agonizing weeks, the city was gripped by an interlude of fear, a tense quiet that felt more ominous than any storm. Candlelight vigils sprang up like desperate prayers across the city, their flickering flames a testament to both sorrow and defiance. Marches, filled with citizens demanding accountability, wound through the streets. The United Nations, their reports echoing with condemnation, pressured the Brazilian government to act, to show the world that such barbarity would not stand. Yet, despite the international outcry, despite the national shame, nobody was in custody. The shooters, the very men who had executed children on the church steps, remained on duty, their weapons still holstered, pending investigation. It was a cruel mockery of justice, a clear signal that the system wasn't just slow, but actively resistant to holding its own accountable. This lack of action, this blatant disregard for justice, fueled a pervasive sense of dread. And then, a new, chilling rumor began to spread like wildfire through the favelas, carried on the wind of whispered conversations and fearful glances. The cops wanted payback. Not just for the international embarrassment Candelaria had caused, not just for the public outcry. No, this was about something far more immediate, far more personal, in their twisted logic. Just days earlier, four officers had been gunned down in Vigario Geral, a working-class community nestled in the north side of Rio. Drug factions, who often controlled these territories, quickly denied involvement. But in the brutal calculus of the streets, guilt is a luxury the poor can't afford. It didn't matter who pulled the trigger in Vigario Geral. The police, in their collective rage, had already decided who would pay the price. The interlude of fear was about to give way to another, even bloodier, explosion. The fuse was lit, and the countdown had begun for Vigario Geral. The night of August 29th, 1993, descended upon Vigario Geral, a favela like many others in Rio, a vibrant community struggling against poverty, but also a place where life, however precarious, found a way. But that night, life was brutally interrupted. Around 9 p.m., a convoy of cars, dark and menacing, sealed the favela's single entrance. There was no escape. Masked men, their faces hidden, their intentions chillingly clear, fanned out through the narrow, winding alleys. Some wore uniforms, a horrifying paradox. Others were cloaked in black hoods, indistinguishable from criminals, yet acting with the state's implicit sanction. They didn't search for specific individuals. This wasn't an investigation. This was pure, unadulterated revenge. They kicked in doors, shattering the fragile peace of homes. They dragged residents, men, women, and even children, into the alleys, into the open, under the merciless glare of the favela's dim streetlights. And then, they sprayed gunfire. It was indiscriminate, a terrifying storm of bullets that tore through flesh, through homes, through lives. The stories from that night are harrowing, almost beyond belief. A grandmother, her face etched with the wisdom of years, was found shot through the very page of Psalms she was reading, her faith literally pierced by a bullet. A 3-year-old, his tiny hand clutching his mother's leg in a desperate, innocent grip, took a bullet. His life, barely begun, extinguished in an instant. The squad even firebombed a makeshift bar, trapping patrons inside, leaving them to burn. This wasn't about justice. It was about terror, about sending a message written in fire and blood. By 9:20 p.m., just 20 minutes after the invasion began, the massacre was complete. 21 bodies lay scattered across the favela, in homes, in alleys, on the dirt paths. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and death. Several houses blazed like torches against the hillside, their flames licking at the night sky, a stark, horrifying beacon of the brutality that had just unfolded. Vigario Gerald wasn't just a massacre. It was an act of collective punishment, a horrifying demonstration of unchecked power, a community annihilated in a fit of vengeful rage. The memory of that night, the screams, the fires, the sheer terror, would forever be etched into the soul of that community, a wound that would never truly heal. The ink wasn't even dry on the reports of the Vigario Gerald massacre before the cover-up playbook was opened. It's a familiar script, isn't it? The same night of the killings, high-ranking officers in the military police, with a straight face, claimed police were nowhere near the area. A blatant, transparent lie, but one they expected to be believed, or at least to sow enough doubt to muddy the waters. The audacity of it, to deny what an entire community had just witnessed, what the very air still smelled of. But truth, sometimes, has a stubborn way of asserting itself. Forensics, thankfully, couldn't be silenced as easily as witnesses. Investigators painstakingly collected shell casings from the scene, pieces of grim evidence that told their own story. And when those casings were matched, through ballistic analysis, to guns signed out from the 21st Battalion, the lie crumbled. It was undeniable proof that it wasn't some rogue gang, some anonymous criminals. It was the police. Still, even with forensic evidence, prosecutors faced an uphill, almost impossible battle. They needed witnesses. Think about that for a moment. They needed people, residents of Vigario Gerald, who had just seen their neighbors, their family members, murdered by armed men, to come forward. And not just come forward, but to sit in a lineup, to point out the faces of men who still wore badges, who still carried guns, who still patrolled their streets. You can guess how that went. The fear was palpable, a suffocating blanket that stifled any whisper of testimony. Who would risk their lives, and the lives of their remaining family, to testify against an institution that had just demonstrated its capacity for such brutal, indiscriminate violence? The cover-up wasn't just about denial. It was about intimidation, about ensuring that fear, not justice, prevailed. It was a perfectly executed strategy to bury the truth under a mountain of terror. Years crawled by. The initial fury, the international condemnation, the promises of justice, all began to fade, replaced by a weary cynicism. Trials for the Candelaria and Vigario Gerald massacres finally convened in 1996, 3 long years after the bloodstained summer. But this wasn't justice as most people understand it. The defendants, the military police officers, were tried under a military penal code provision, a system designed, it often seemed, to protect its own. This meant closed sessions, away from the prying eyes of the public and the media, and, crucially, lenient sentencing ranges. It was a system built for a different kind of justice, one that prioritized institutional loyalty over individual accountability. For Candelaria, where 8 children were executed, only 1 officer was convicted and sentenced to 31 years. 31 years for the murder of 8 innocent lives. But even that was a hollow victory. He served a mere 6 years. 6 years. Think about the outrage, the disbelief. What message does that send? That the lives of street children are worth less than a decade of a murderer's freedom? In Vigario Gerald, the outcome was even more disheartening. Where 21 lives were brutally extinguished, for officers received light sentences. Others, despite the overwhelming evidence, walked free for lack of proof, a phrase that tasted like ash in the mouths of survivors. It wasn't justice, it was a charade. A lawyer for the survivors, her voice heavy with exhaustion and frustration, perfectly encapsulated the bitter truth. The judiciary handed out slaps on the wrist with one hand and high fives with the other. It was a damning indictment, revealing a system that wasn't just flawed, but actively complicit in perpetuating impunity. The courtrooms, meant to be temples of justice, instead became stages for a cruel, cynical performance, where the powerful walked free and the victims were left with nothing but their grief and a profound sense of betrayal. The bloodiest summer might have been over, but the winter of injustice was just beginning. Among the children who miraculously escaped the hail of bullets that horrific night at Candelaria was a 15-year-old boy named Sandro do Nascimento. He was one of the lucky ones, or so it seemed. But what does survival mean when your world has been shattered, when the very people meant to protect you become your executioners? Sandro, like so many others, was left with nothing. No therapy to process the trauma, no family to offer solace, no support system to guide him. He was a child, adrift in a city that had proven it wanted him gone. So, what happens to a child who witnesses such unspeakable horror and is then abandoned by society? Sandro's trajectory became a tragic, almost inevitable, consequence of that neglect. He graduated from sleeping on the church steps to petty theft, a desperate attempt to survive. From petty theft, the path, in his world, led inexorably to armed robbery. He became a product of the very violence that had almost claimed him. Then, in 2000, 7 years after Candelaria, Sandro do Nascimento re-entered the national consciousness in the most dramatic, heartbreaking way. He hijacked a city bus, taking passengers hostage, holding not just them, but an entire nation's media captive for 5 agonizing hours. It was a desperate, chaotic cry for help, an act born of profound trauma and systemic failure. When the SWAT team finally stormed the bus, live cameras captured what looked, to many horrified viewers, like an execution. Sandro, the survivor of Candelaria, died that day, not by a single bullet from an AR-15 on church steps, but by the slow, grinding violence of neglect and a society that couldn't, or wouldn't, save him. The acclaimed documentary, Bus 174, meticulously tracked his life, tracing his tragic path right back to those blood-stained church steps. For those who watched, a chilling realization dawned. The Candelaria massacre never really ended. It didn't stop with the last body bag. It just changed weapons. It mutated into neglect, into systemic abandonment, into the very desperation that drove Sandro to that bus. His story became a living, breathing testament to the enduring legacy of impunity, a stark reminder that when society fails its most vulnerable, the consequences echo for generations, leaving a trail of broken lives in their wake. Sandro was not just a criminal. He was a monument to a profound societal failure. Fast forward almost 3 decades. You'd think, wouldn't you, that a country would learn from such horrific episodes? That the lessons of Candelaria and Vigario Geral would be deeply etched into its collective memory, serving as a permanent warning against unchecked state violence. But the legacy of impunity, like a persistent phantom limb, continues to plague Brazil. In 2018, as the country grappled with rising crime rates, Brazil's federal security plan, instead of focusing on social programs or community policing, actively encouraged military interventions in Rio's favelas. It was a chilling echo of the past, a return to the very strategies that led to the massacres of '93. And what were the results? Predictable and horrifying. Deaths during police operations in Rio rose by a staggering 61% in just 12 months. It was a bloodbath, a state-sanctioned escalation of violence against its own citizens, primarily the poor and marginalized. When questioned, when confronted with these grim statistics, officials recycled the exact same rhetoric from the 90s. They spoke of collateral damage in the fight against crime. Collateral damage. Think about that phrase. It's a dehumanizing term, a clinical way to dismiss human lives, to justify the unjustifiable. It's the same phrase, the exact same chilling logic, that was used to justify the slaughter at Candelaria and the butchery in Vigario Geral. Only now, it's not just playing on grainy television sets. It's upgraded to 4K, broadcast nightly, normalized, accepted. The language of impunity, the justification for state violence against the poor, hasn't changed. It's merely been repackaged, given a fresh coat of paint, but the core message remains the same. Some lives are worth less, and their deaths are an acceptable cost in the endless war on crime. The massacres of 1993 weren't isolated incidents. They were a blueprint, a dark prophecy of a future where accountability remains elusive and the cycle of violence continues, unbroken. The legacy isn't just history, it's a living, breathing, and tragically killing policy. If you want to truly understand how a country can normalize police killings, how it can turn a blind eye to the slaughter of its own citizens, then you have to keep digging. Don't just accept the headlines, go beyond them. Read the 1993 UN report on the Candelaria massacre. It's a stark, unvarnished account. Watch Bus 174, not just as a true crime documentary, but as a profound character study of a survivor failed by his society. Look up the current numbers at Fogo Cruzado, an invaluable resource tracking gun violence in Rio, and see how little has truly changed. And next time someone mentions Rio's undeniable beauty, its breathtaking landscapes, its vibrant culture, remember the cold, unforgiving steps of Candelaria Church, stained with the blood of children. Remember the narrow, terror-filled alleys of Vigario Geral, echoing with screams and gunfire. History isn't just samba and sunsets, isn't just carnival and Christ the Redeemer. Sometimes it's gunpowder and zip body bags. Sometimes it's the inconvenient, brutal truth that lies beneath the postcard-perfect facade. Why does any of this still matter? Why drag up these old, painful wounds from 3 decades ago? Because Brazil is heading into another election cycle, and you'll see law and order bumper stickers everywhere, plastered on cars, dominating political rhetoric. And in that environment, the past has a dangerous way of repeating itself. Because 8 kids sleeping on cold stone steps can, with a slight rhetorical twist, be reimagined as a public hazard, a nuisance, rather than a profound humanitarian failure. It's a subtle but insidious shift in language, a way to justify indifference, or worse, violence. And perhaps most critically, it matters because when institutions, those powerful, supposedly impartial bodies, actively shield perpetrators, when they protect those who commit atrocities in their name, then the past isn't even past. It's not some dusty It reminds us that there are no easy answers, only profound consequences when accountability is abandoned. The bloodiest summer in Rio didn't truly end with the last body bag, with the last scream fading into the night. It merely cooled, congealed into an endless winter of forgetting, a chilling silence that allows the seeds of future violence to germinate. And until accountability replaces impunity, until the lives of the poor are valued as much as the lives of the powerful, the cycle stays stuck on repeat, powered by the engine of a state that, tragically, learned to kill its young and call it order. And that, my friends, is a story that demands to be remembered, to be told, again and again, until justice, finally, breaks the cycle.